The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Captain Marcus Whitfield adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what felt like the 100th time. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold autumn air, but from the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. Today was the day of the Grand Military Parade, an event that happened only once every 5 years, and the entire Royal Guard unit was expected to perform flawlessly in front of thousands of spectators, including foreign dignitaries, government, officials, and members of the royal family. Marcus had been preparing his men for this moment for over 18 months. Every morning at dawn, they would march in perfect formation across the palace grounds. Every afternoon, they practiced their ceremonial rifle presentations until their movements became as natural as breathing. The Royal Guard was considered the elite of the elite, hand-picked from the finest soldiers in the kingdom's army. Their reputation was built on centuries of tradition, discipline, and unwavering dedication to protecting the crown. But as Marcus looked at his reflection in the polished brass buttons of his uniform, doubt crept into his mind like an unwelcome visitor. His unit consisted of 24 carefully selected men, each one a veteran with years of military service. There was Sergeant Thompson, a decorated war hero who had served 3 tours overseas. Private Collins, barely 22 but already showing exceptional leadership qualities. Lieutenant Hayes, whose father and grandfather had both served in the Royal Guard before him. These were good men, trained men, men who deserved better than the whispers that had been following them for weeks. The whispers started small, as they always do in military circles. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there. Word had somehow spread through the palace staff and even reached the ears of other military units that Captain Whitfield's Royal Guard was not quite up to standard. Some said they had seen the Guards stumble during practice. Others claimed their formations were sloppy, their timing off by crucial seconds. The rumors grew like wildfire, fed by jealousy from other units who had hoped to be chosen for the prestigious parade duty. Marcus knew the truth was more complicated than the gossip suggested. Yes, his men had faced challenges during training. The new ceremonial protocols introduced just 6 months ago had required them to learn entirely different marching patterns. The addition of a complex rifle ceremony, borrowed from an ancient tradition that had not been performed in over 50 years, had proven more difficult than anyone anticipated. But his soldiers had worked tirelessly to master these skills, often staying long after their official training hours ended, practicing by lamplight in the courtyard until their movements became precise and coordinated. The captain walked through the barracks, observing his men as they prepared for the day ahead. Each soldier was focused, methodical in his preparations. They polished their boots until they gleamed like mirrors. They brushed their uniforms until not a single thread was out of place. Their rifles, purely ceremonial but maintained to military standards, were cleaned and inspected with the same care a combat soldier would show his weapon before battle. Sergeant Thompson approached Marcus with a concerned expression on his weathered face. He had served under 3 different captains during his career and had developed an instinct for reading the mood of his commanding officers. "Sir, the men are ready," he reported, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying a hint of worry. "But I have to ask, are you concerned about the stories going around? Some of the palace staff have been making comments, and I worry it might affect morale." Marcus considered his response carefully. Leadership meant being honest with his men, while also maintaining their confidence. "Sergeant, every great military unit has faced criticism and doubt. What matters is not what others say about us, but what we know to be true about ourselves and our capabilities. We have trained harder than any Royal Guard unit in recent memory. We know our duties, we know our formations, and we know our honor is on the line today." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, the palace's chief military coordinator. Davidson was a stern man in his 50s, known for his exacting standards and his ability to spot the smallest imperfection in military ceremonies. His presence always made soldiers stand a little straighter and speak a little more formally. "Captain Whitfield," Davidson began, his tone businesslike and direct. "I trust your men are prepared for today's ceremony. The schedule has been moved, up by 30 minutes due to the early arrival of the foreign delegation from the northern kingdoms. This means less time for final preparations and absolutely no room for delays or mistakes." Marcus felt his stomach tighten, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, sir. The men are ready, and we will be in position with time to spare." Davidson's eyes swept over the assembled soldiers, taking in every detail of their appearance and bearing. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he nodded curtly. "See that you are, Captain. The reputation of the entire palace guard depends on today's performance. There can be no room for the kind of irregularities that have been reported during your training sessions." After Davidson left, the weight of expectations settled over the barracks like a heavy blanket. Marcus could see the tension in his men's faces, the way their jaw muscles tightened and their breathing became more controlled. They had all heard the lieutenant colonel's words, and they understood the implications. This was not just another ceremonial duty. This was a test of their worthiness to wear the Royal Guard uniform. As the morning progressed and the time for the parade approached, Marcus gathered his men for a final briefing. Standing before them in the same courtyard where they had practiced countless times, he looked into the faces of soldiers who had become like family to him over the months of preparation. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the courtyard with quiet authority, "in 1 hour, we will march onto that parade ground and show everyone present what it truly means to serve as the Royal Guard. We know we have trained well. We know we are prepared. Whatever happens out there, we will face it together, as a unit, with honor and dignity." The 24 men standing before him responded with a unified, "Yes, sir," that echoed off the palace walls. But as they began their final preparations, none of them could have predicted that their moment of greatest challenge was still ahead of them, waiting on the parade ground where hundreds of eyes would soon be watching their every move. The grand military parade ground stretched out before them like a vast stage, its perfectly manicured grass marked with precise white lines indicating where each unit should position themselves. Temporary grandstands had been erected along both sides of the field, already filling with spectators despite the early hour. The morning air buzzed with anticipation and the low murmur of hundreds of conversations in multiple languages as diplomats, nobles, and distinguished guests took their seats. Captain Marcus Whitfield led his Royal Guard unit through the gates and onto the field, their boots hitting the ground in perfect synchronization. The sound of their marching created a rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to announce their arrival to everyone present. Marcus could feel the weight of countless eyes upon them as they moved toward their designated position at the center of the parade ground, the place of highest honor, reserved for the kingdom's most elite soldiers. From his position at the front of the formation, Marcus could see the royal reviewing stand, an elaborate platform draped in the kingdom's colors where members of the royal family would soon take their seats. To the left and right of the main stand were smaller platforms reserved for foreign dignitaries, military attachés, and government officials. The sight was both inspiring and intimidating, a reminder that their performance would be witnessed not just by their own countrymen, but by representatives from nations across the continent. As they reached their position, Marcus gave the command to halt, and 24 pairs of boots struck the ground as one. The Royal Guard stood at attention, their rifles held at precisely the correct angle, their heads high and their eyes focused straight ahead. Around them, other military units were taking their positions. The artillery corps with their polished cannons, the cavalry regiment with their magnificent horses, and the regular infantry battalions that formed the backbone of the kingdom's defense forces. Sergeant Thompson, standing in the second rank, felt a bead of sweat form on his forehead. Despite the cool morning air, he had participated in dozens of military ceremonies during his career, but none had felt as crucial as this one. The weeks of rumors and whispered criticisms had created an atmosphere of doubt that even the most experienced soldiers could not entirely ignore. He glanced sideways at Private Collins, whose young face showed the strain of trying to maintain perfect composure while fighting off obvious nerves. The ceremony began with the arrival of the royal family, announced by a fanfare of trumpets that echoed across the parade ground. King Edward, a distinguished man in his 60s, wearing the full-dress uniform of a field marshal, walked onto the reviewing stand with measured steps that spoke of decades of military experience. Behind him came Queen Charlotte, elegant in a deep blue dress that complemented the royal colors, and their son, Prince William, himself a serving officer in the Navy. As the royal family took their seats, the crowd in the grandstands rose as one, creating a wave of motion and sound that rippled across the entire field. The sight was magnificent, a display of pageantry and tradition that connected the present moment to centuries of the kingdom's history. For a brief moment, Marcus felt his doubts fade as he was swept up in the grandeur of the occasion. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, serving as the parade marshal, stepped forward to begin the formal proceedings. His voice, amplified by strategically placed speakers, carried clearly across the field as he announced the beginning of the ceremony. Your Majesty, distinguished guests, citizens of the realm, we gather today to honor the brave men and women who defend our kingdom and preserve our way of life. The first part of the ceremony proceeded flawlessly. The artillery corps demonstrated their precision by firing a 21-gun salute that thundered across the parade ground, the sound rolling like distant storm clouds over the assembled crowd. The cavalry regiment performed a series of intricate maneuvers, their horses moving with the grace and coordination that came from months of careful training. Each unit that performed received enthusiastic applause from the spectators, building the energy and excitement of the event. Marcus watched the other units with a mixture of admiration and growing anxiety. Their performances were indeed impressive, setting a high standard for what would be expected when the Royal Guard's turn came. He could feel his men's tension increasing as their moment approached, the weight of expectation becoming almost palpable in the crisp autumn air. When Lieutenant Colonel Davidson announced that the Royal Guard would now perform their ceremonial presentation, a hush fell over the crowd. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the chance to see the kingdom's most elite soldiers demonstrate the skills and discipline that had made them legendary. Marcus took a deep breath and prepared to give the commands that would set the complex ceremony in motion. The Royal Guard ceremonial presentation was an elaborate sequence that combined traditional marching formations with an intricate rifle ceremony that told the story of the kingdom's military history. It began with a slow, measured march in a diamond formation, followed by a series of precise turns and counter-turns that would bring the unit into a perfect line facing the royal reviewing stand. Then came the rifle ceremony itself, a choreographed sequence of movements that required each soldier to perform dozens of individual actions in perfect coordination with his fellow guards. Marcus gave the first command, and his men began to move. For the first few moments, everything went according to plan. The diamond formation was perfect, their spacing exact, their timing synchronized. The crowd watched in appreciative silence as the Royal Guard began to demonstrate why they were considered the kingdom's finest soldiers. But as they moved into the more complex part of the formation, disaster struck. Private Collins, perhaps, overcome by nerves or distracted by the magnitude of the occasion, missed a crucial step in the sequence. Instead of turning left with the rest of his rank, he continued straight ahead, breaking the perfect symmetry of the formation and creating a gap that was immediately visible to everyone watching. The mistake created a ripple effect through the rest of the unit. Soldiers who were expecting Collins to be in his proper position found themselves out of alignment. Some tried to compensate by adjusting their own positions, while others maintained their original course, creating further confusion in the ranks. What should have been a flawless display of military precision became a visible demonstration of disorder and uncertainty. Marcus felt his heart sink as he realized what was happening behind him. Without breaking his own position or betraying his emotions to the watching crowd, he tried to give subtle commands to help his men recover. But the damage was spreading through the formation like cracks in breaking ice, and there seemed to be no way to stop it without calling a complete halt to the ceremony. In the grandstands, the murmur of conversation began to grow as spectators noticed the problems with the Royal Guard's performance. Some pointed discreetly at the confused formations, while others whispered behind their programs about the unit that was supposed to represent the very best of the kingdom's military tradition. The rumors and criticisms that had preceded this day suddenly seemed prophetic, as if the doubters had been proven right in the most public way possible. The confusion in the Royal Guard formation continued to spread like ripples in a disturbed pond. What had begun as Private Collins's single misstep had now affected nearly half the unit, with soldiers uncertain whether to maintain their original positions or attempt to compensate for their displaced comrades. Captain Marcus Whitfield could hear the growing murmur from the grandstands, a sound that seemed to grow louder with each passing second of the deteriorating performance. Sergeant Thompson, his years of military experience kicking in, tried desperately to salvage the situation. Using subtle hand signals and barely audible commands, he attempted to guide the confused soldiers back into proper formation. But the complexity of the ceremonial sequence meant that any deviation from the planned choreography created cascading problems that were nearly impossible to correct in real time. From the royal reviewing stand, King Edward watched the unfolding disaster with a carefully neutral expression. As a former military officer himself, he understood immediately what was happening and could appreciate the difficulty of the situation facing the Royal Guard. However, he was also acutely aware that hundreds of foreign dignitaries and representatives were witnessing what appeared to be a fundamental failure of his kingdom's supposedly elite military unit. Queen Charlotte leaned slightly toward her husband and whispered something in his ear, her face showing concern not just for the ceremony but for the soldiers who were clearly struggling on the field below. Prince William, his own military training making him particularly sensitive to the situation, watched with growing tension as the Royal Guard's reputation crumbled before their eyes. In the diplomatic section of the grandstand, Ambassador Hendricks from the Eastern Confederation exchanged meaningful glances with his military attaché. They had come to this ceremony partly to assess the military capabilities of their neighboring kingdom, and what they were witnessing suggested significant problems with training and discipline in even the most elite units. The ambassador made a mental note to include this observation in his report back to his government. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson stood frozen at his position as parade marshal, his mind racing through possible options for dealing with the crisis unfolding before him. Military ceremonies were supposed to demonstrate strength, discipline, and national pride. Instead, the kingdom's most prestigious unit was providing a very public example of confusion and failure. He could call a halt to the Royal Guard's portion of the ceremony, but that would only emphasize the magnitude of the problem and create an even more embarrassing situation. On the field, Captain Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. His men were now visibly struggling, some having stopped moving entirely while they waited for clear direction, others continuing with movements that no longer matched the actions of their fellow soldiers. The rifle ceremony, which required precise timing and coordination, had become impossible to execute properly with the formation in such disarray. Private Collins, the young soldier whose initial mistake had triggered the cascade of problems, stood rigid with horror as he realized what his error had caused. His face flushed red with embarrassment and shame, but military discipline kept him in position even as his mistake continued to affect the entire unit. Around him, veteran soldiers who had never experienced such a public failure struggled to maintain their composure while dealing with a situation for which their training had not prepared them. The crowd's reaction was becoming increasingly uncomfortable to witness. What had begun as polite murmuring had evolved into more obvious conversations and pointing. Some spectators appeared sympathetic to the soldiers' plight, understanding that even the best-trained military units could face unexpected challenges. Others seemed to take a more critical view, suggesting that such problems indicated deeper issues with the kingdom's military readiness and training standards. In the section reserved for retired military officers, Field Marshal Lord Ashworth sat with growing consternation. At 78 years old, he had witnessed more military ceremonies than perhaps anyone else present, and he had never seen the Royal Guard perform so poorly. As someone who had helped establish many of the traditions and standards that governed the kingdom's military ceremonies, he felt a personal connection to what was happening on the field. Field Marshal Ashworth had served the crown for over 5 decades, rising through every rank from second lieutenant to the highest position in the kingdom's military hierarchy. He had commanded troops in 3 different conflicts, managed peacekeeping, operations in troubled regions, and served as a military advisor to 2 different monarchs. His understanding of military affairs was considered unparalleled, and his opinions carried enormous weight within both military and government circles. As he watched the Royal Guard's continued struggles, the Field Marshal's expression remained carefully composed, but his keen eyes took in every detail of the unfolding situation. He could see that Captain Whitfield was a competent officer caught in an impossible situation. He could observe that most of the soldiers were well-trained and disciplined, despite their current difficulties, and he could recognize that what was happening on the field was not necessarily indicative of fundamental problems with the unit, but rather the result of a single mistake cascading through a complex ceremonial sequence. The other retired officers, sitting near Field Marshal Ashworth, began to mutter among themselves, their comments ranging from sympathy for the struggling soldiers to criticism of modern training methods. Some suggested that such problems would never have occurred in their day when military discipline was supposedly stricter and standards higher. Others argued that the complexity of modern ceremonial requirements had grown beyond reasonable limits, creating situations where even minor errors could lead to major embarrassments. Colonel retired Harrison, who had served under Field Marshal Ashworth decades earlier, leaned toward his former commander and spoke in a low voice that wouldn't carry to other spectators. "This is painful to watch, sir. Those men have clearly worked hard to prepare for this ceremony, but sometimes circumstances beyond anyone's control can derail even the best planning." Field Marshal Ashworth nodded slightly, but remained focused on the field, where Captain Marcus was making a final attempt to bring his unit back into proper formation. The captain had decided to simplify the remaining ceremonial movements, hoping to conclude their portion of the parade with at least some semblance of military bearing intact. The decision showed good leadership judgment, but it came too late to salvage the overall impression created by the Royal Guard's performance. By the time they managed to form a reasonably straight line for their final salute to the royal family, the damage to their reputation had been done. The ceremony that was supposed to showcase the kingdom's military excellence had instead highlighted apparent problems with training, preparation, and execution. As the Royal Guard completed their truncated ceremony and began to march off the field, the applause from the grandstands was notably restrained. Rather than the enthusiastic response that typically greeted the kingdom's elite soldiers, there was a scattered, polite clapping that seemed more sympathetic than appreciative. The contrast with the vigorous applause that had greeted the previous units was stark and impossible to ignore. Field Marshal Ashworth continued to watch intently as the Royal Guard departed, his experienced eyes noting details that casual observers would miss. He saw the way Captain Marcus maintained his bearing despite the obvious disappointment and embarrassment. He observed how Sergeant Thompson kept his men moving in good order even after their ceremonial performance had failed. And he noticed the determination in the soldiers' faces as they marched away, their heads still high despite the public setback they had just experienced. The remainder of the grand military parade proceeded without incident. but the shadow cast by the Royal Guard's failed performance seemed to hang over the entire event. Other military units executed their ceremonies flawlessly, receiving the enthusiastic applause they deserved, yet conversations in the grandstands continued to return to the spectacular failure they had all witnessed. The very unit that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of the kingdom's military tradition had instead become the most talked-about disappointment of the day. As the official ceremony concluded and spectators began to file out of the grandstands, the conversations grew more open and pointed. Diplomats discussed what they had seen in terms of its implications for the kingdom's military readiness. Government officials wondered aloud about the effectiveness of current training programs, and military leadership, members of the nobility, many of whom had sons and daughters serving in various military branches, debated whether the Royal Guard's failure represented a broader decline in military standards. Ambassador Hendricks from the Eastern Confederation found himself surrounded by colleagues from other nations, all eager to discuss the implications of what they had witnessed. "I must say," commented the representative from the southern provinces, "it raises questions about their military capabilities if even their ceremonial units cannot perform basic formations correctly." The ambassador from the northern kingdoms nodded in agreement. "Our intelligence reports have always suggested that this kingdom maintains high military standards, but today's display certainly challenges that assessment. If their elite guards struggle with parade formations, one wonders how they might perform in actual combat situations." These conversations, while conducted in diplomatic language, carried serious implications for the kingdom's international standing. Military ceremonies served multiple purposes beyond mere pageantry. They were opportunities for nations to demonstrate their military competence and readiness to both allies and potential adversaries. The Royal Guard's failure had inadvertently sent a message of weakness and poor preparation that would likely be reported back to governments across the continent. In the section where retired military officers had been seated, the discussions were even more pointed and informed. These men had decades of experience in military affairs and understood better than most civilians the significance of what they had witnessed. Colonel Retired Harrison shook his head as he spoke with his former colleagues. "In all my years of service, I've never seen the Royal Guard perform so poorly. Something has gone seriously wrong with their training or leadership." Another retired officer added his perspective. "The young captain seemed competent enough, but clearly his men weren't properly prepared for the pressure of a major ceremony. When I served, we would have rehearsed such formations hundreds of times until they became second nature." Field Marshal Lord Ashworth listened to these conversations with growing concern, not just for the Royal Guard, but for the broader implications of their failure. As someone who had devoted his entire adult life to maintaining the kingdom's military reputation and effectiveness, he understood that the damage done today would extend far beyond a single embarrassing ceremony. Military reputation, built over decades of careful attention to standards and performance, could be severely undermined by a single public failure. The field marshal also recognized something that many of the other observers seemed to miss: the fundamental difference between ceremonial performance and actual military capability. Having commanded troops in real combat situations, he knew that the skills required for parade formations had little correlation with a unit's effectiveness in actual military operations. However, he also understood that public perception often mattered as much as reality when it came to military affairs and international relations. Meanwhile, back in the palace barracks, Captain Marcus Whitfield faced the most difficult moment of his military career. His men had returned from the parade ground in dejected silence, each soldier dealing with the embarrassment and disappointment in his own way. The barracks, which that morning had been filled with nervous energy and anticipation, now felt heavy, with the weight of failure and shattered expectations. Sergeant Thompson, his weathered face showing the strain of the day's events, approached his commanding officer with obvious reluctance. "Sir, the men are taking this hard. Some of them are talking about requesting transfers to other units. They feel like they've let down not just themselves, but the entire tradition of the Royal Guard." Marcus nodded, understanding his sergeant's concern. Military units depended on esprit de corps, the shared sense of pride and identity that motivated soldiers to perform at their best. When that confidence was shattered, it could take months or even years to rebuild, assuming it could be rebuilt at all. Private Collins, the young soldier whose initial mistake had triggered the cascade of problems, sat alone on his bunk with his head in his hands. Despite his fellow soldiers' attempts to reassure him that anyone could have made such a mistake, he felt personally responsible for the unit's public humiliation. The weight of knowing that his error had damaged the reputation of men he respected and admired was almost unbearable. Lieutenant Hayes, coming from a family with generations of Royal Guard service, struggled with the knowledge that his father and grandfather would certainly learn about the day's events. The family tradition of excellence in the Royal Guard, built over decades of distinguished service, seemed to have been damaged by a single afternoon's poor performance. The immediate aftermath of the ceremony brought additional challenges for Captain Marcus and his men. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson arrived at the barracks within an hour of the parade's conclusion, his expression grim and his manner more formal than usual. Military failures of such a public nature required immediate attention and formal documentation, processes that would further emphasize the magnitude of what had occurred. "Captain Whitfield," Davidson began, his voice carrying the weight of official authority, "I need a complete report on today's events within 24 hours. The commanding general wants a full analysis of what went wrong and what steps will be taken to ensure such problems don't occur in the future." Marcus straightened to attention, accepting the responsibility that came with command. "Yes, sir. The report will be completed on schedule." Davidson's expression softened slightly as he continued. "I want you to understand, Captain, that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. However, I've observed your men during their training, and I know they're capable soldiers. Sometimes circumstances beyond anyone's control can derail even the best preparations." After Davidson departed, Marcus gathered his men for what he knew would be one of the most important addresses of his command. Looking at the faces of soldiers, who had worked tirelessly to prepare for their moment of glory, only to experience such public disappointment, he felt the full weight of military leadership. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil he felt. "Today did not go as any of us hoped or expected. We made mistakes, and those mistakes were witnessed by hundreds of people who had every right to expect better from us. However, what defines us as soldiers is not whether we face setbacks, but how we respond to them." The words were professional and appropriate, but Marcus could see in his men's faces that they would need time and concrete actions, not just speeches, to rebuild their confidence and restore their unit's reputation. The road ahead would be long and difficult, requiring not just renewed training but a fundamental rebuilding of the trust and pride that had been damaged by the day's events. As evening fell over the palace grounds, news of the Royal Guard's failure was already spreading beyond the immediate witnesses to the ceremony, carried by departing dignitaries to their home countries and by palace staff to their families and friends in the surrounding city. The news of the Royal Guard's failure spread through the capital city with the speed that only truly sensational stories achieve. By evening, taverns and coffee houses buzzed with animated discussions about what people were already calling the greatest military embarrassment in recent memory. Palace servants, who had witnessed the ceremony from their designated viewing areas, shared detailed accounts with their families and neighbors, each retelling seeming to make the Royal Guard's performance appear even worse than it had actually been. The kingdom's newspapers, always eager for stories that would capture public attention, began preparing special editions that would appear on the streets by morning. Reporters who had covered the parade worked late into the night, crafting articles with headlines like "Elite Guard Stumbles in Royal Ceremony" and "Military Precision Fails on Parade Ground." The stories, while factually accurate, emphasized the most dramatic moments of the failed performance while giving little attention to the months of preparation that had preceded it. In diplomatic quarters throughout the city, foreign representatives composed cables to their home governments describing what they had witnessed. These official reports, written in the careful language of international diplomacy, nevertheless conveyed clear messages about apparent weaknesses in the kingdom's military establishment. The failure of the royal guard, traditionally seen as a symbol of the kingdom's military excellence, would inevitably influence how other nations viewed the kingdom's overall defense capabilities and international standing. Captain Marcus Whitfield spent the evening in his office working on the detailed report that Lieutenant Colonel Davidson had requested. The task of analyzing and documenting his unit's failure proved more difficult than commanding them in the first place. Every aspect of their preparation had seemed adequate at the time, yet somehow it had not been sufficient for the pressures of the actual ceremony. As he wrote, Marcus found himself questioning not just the specific decisions that had led to the day's problems, but his fundamental qualifications as a military leader. The captain's report methodically examined every aspect of the Royal Guard's preparation and performance. He documented the training schedule they had followed, the various rehearsals they had conducted, and the specific sequence of events that had led to Private Collins' crucial mistake and its cascading consequences. Reading through his own analysis, Marcus was struck by how many factors had to align perfectly for a ceremonial performance to succeed, and how quickly everything could fall apart when even one element went wrong. Meanwhile, in the section of the city where retired military officers typically gathered, the conversations were becoming more heated and pointed with each passing hour. The Veterans Club, a prestigious establishment that served as an informal meeting place for former military leaders, was filled with animated discussions about the day's events and their broader implications for the kingdom's defense establishment. Colonel. Retired Harrison found himself defending Captain Marcus and his men against increasingly harsh criticism from his former colleagues. "We need to remember," he argued, "that these are good soldiers who had an unfortunate day. Military history is full of examples of excellent units that experienced temporary setbacks without it reflecting their true capabilities." However, his arguments were met with skepticism from officers who felt that the Royal Guard's failure represented something more serious than a simple bad day. Retired General Morrison, whose own service had included multiple combat commands, expressed the view shared by many of his contemporaries. "The Royal Guard isn't just another military unit. They're supposed to represent the very best of our military tradition. When they fail so publicly, it calls into question the standards and training methods of our entire military establishment." As these debates continued late into the evening, Field Marshal Lord Ashworth remained notably silent, listening carefully to the various perspectives being offered by his former colleagues. His reputation and experience commanded respect from everyone present, and many were waiting to hear his assessment of the situation. However, the Field Marshal seemed to be weighing his words carefully, considering not just what had happened, but what it might mean for the future. Back at the palace, the royal family was dealing with their own concerns about the day's events. King Edward, whose long military service had given him deep appreciation for the challenges facing professional soldiers, was primarily concerned about the impact on the men involved, rather than the broader political implications. However, Queen Charlotte and Prince William were more focused on the potential damage to the kingdom's international reputation and the questions that foreign governments might raise about military readiness. The royal family's private secretary had already begun receiving inquiries from various government ministries about the ceremony and its implications. The Foreign Ministry wanted to know if special diplomatic efforts would be needed to address concerns raised by foreign representatives who had witnessed the Royal Guard's poor performance. The Defense Ministry was asking whether the incident suggested broader problems with military training that needed immediate attention. These official inquiries added another layer of pressure to an already difficult situation. What had begun as a ceremonial failure was rapidly evolving into a potential crisis of confidence in the kingdom's military institutions. The Royal Guard, which was supposed to be a source of national pride, had instead become a symbol of institutional weakness and poor preparation. In the barracks, the Royal Guard soldiers were dealing with their personal reactions to the day's events in various ways. Some, like Sergeant Thompson, threw themselves into maintenance tasks and equipment inspections, using familiar routines to cope with their disappointment. Others, particularly the younger soldiers like Private Collins, struggled with feelings of guilt and inadequacy that threatened to undermine their confidence in their military abilities. The unit's morale, which had been strong throughout months of preparation, was now at its lowest point since the men had been selected for Royal Guard duty. The shared sense of pride and mission that had motivated them through countless hours of training had been replaced by doubt and embarrassment that affected every aspect of their military bearing. Lieutenant Hayes, whose family legacy in the Royal Guard made the failure particularly painful for him, found himself questioning whether he was suited for military service at all. The thought that his mistake-prone performance might have contributed to the unit's problems weighed heavily on him, even though objective analysis showed that the primary issues had originated elsewhere in the formation. As midnight approached, and the palace grounds grew quiet, Captain Marcus completed his official report and reflected on the broader implications of the day's events. He understood that military careers could be made or destroyed by single incidents, particularly when those incidents occurred in such public settings. The Royal Guard's failure would follow him and his men for years to come, affecting their prospects for promotion, transfer to desired assignments, and recognition for future achievements. The captain also recognized that tomorrow would bring new challenges as the kingdom's military leadership decided how to respond to the crisis. There would likely be investigations, policy changes, and personnel decisions that could reshape not just the Royal Guard but military ceremonial activities throughout the kingdom. The weight of knowing that his unit's single afternoon of poor performance might influence military practices for years to come added another dimension to his sense of responsibility and regret. Outside the palace walls, the city continued to buzz with conversations about the day's events, setting the stage for what would undoubtedly be weeks of continued discussion, analysis, and debate about the Royal Guard's failure and its meaning for the kingdom's military future. The morning after the parade brought no relief from the storm of criticism that had engulfed the Royal Guard. The kingdom's major newspapers featured prominent headlines about the military embarrassment, with detailed accounts that seemed to make the failure appear even more dramatic than it had been in reality. Political commentators used the incident to question broader military policies, while editorial writers debated what the failure meant for the kingdom's international standing and defense preparedness. Captain Marcus Whitfield arrived at his office before dawn, hoping to avoid the inevitable encounters with other officers who would want to discuss the previous day's events. However, his hopes were quickly dashed when he found Lieutenant Colonel Davidson waiting for him with a grim expression, and a folder full of documents that could only mean more trouble for the beleaguered Royal Guard unit. "Captain," Davidson began without preamble, "the commanding general has reviewed your report and has ordered a complete investigation into the Royal Guard's training procedures and leadership structure. Additionally, there are questions being raised at the highest levels of government about whether the entire ceremonial guard program needs to be restructured or possibly eliminated altogether." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The possibility that his unit's failure might lead to the dissolution of the Royal Guard tradition, which stretched back centuries, was almost too devastating to contemplate. Generations of soldiers had served with honor and distinction in these ranks, building a legacy of service and excellence that now seemed threatened by a single afternoon's poor performance. As the morning progressed, the situation continued to deteriorate. Palace staff members who had previously treated the Royal Guard with deference and respect now seemed to regard them with a mixture of pity and disappointment. Other military units stationed at the palace made barely concealed comments about the former elite and questioned whether the Royal Guard deserved their privileged status and prestigious assignments. Sergeant Thompson, whose decades of military experience had given him thick skin against most forms of criticism, found himself struggling with the constant reminders of their failure. Everywhere he went within the palace complex, conversations seemed to stop when he appeared, only to resume in whispered tones after he passed. The respect that had been automatically accorded to Royal Guard personnel for generations had evaporated overnight. Private Collins, the young soldier whose initial mistake had triggered the cascade of problems, was dealing with an even more difficult situation. Despite repeated assurances from his officers and fellow soldiers that anyone could have made such an error, he continued to blame himself for the unit's disgrace. The weight of knowing that his moment of confusion had damaged the reputations of men he respected and admired was affecting his ability to perform even basic military duties. By midday, the criticism had reached such intensity that Captain Marcus was beginning to consider the possibility that he might need to request transfer to another unit or even resign his commission entirely. The damage to his military reputation seemed irreparable, and the constant stream of negative attention was affecting not just him, but every soldier under his command. It was at this lowest point, when the future of the Royal Guard seemed most uncertain, that Field Marshal Lord Ashworth made an unexpected appearance at the palace. The 78-year-old veteran, whose opinions carried enormous weight throughout the military establishment, had spent the previous evening and morning carefully considering the situation and had reached some important conclusions about what he had witnessed during the parade. Field Marshal Ashworth's arrival at the palace created immediate interest among the staff and military personnel present. His reputation as the kingdom's most distinguished military leader meant that his assessment of the Royal Guard situation would likely influence all subsequent decisions about their future. However, nobody was prepared for what the Field Marshal was about to do. Instead of heading to the offices where military leadership typically conducted their business, Field Marshal Ashworth walked directly to the barracks where the Royal Guard was stationed. His appearance there was so unusual that soldiers throughout the complex stopped what they were doing to observe what was happening. Senior officers rarely visited enlisted barracks, and field marshals almost never did so unless there was a crisis of unprecedented magnitude. Captain Marcus, who was informed of the field marshal's arrival by a breathless aide, rushed to meet the distinguished visitor. As he approached, Marcus prepared himself for what he assumed would be a formal dressing down from the kingdom's highest-ranking military officer. The captain's military bearing remained perfect, but internally he was bracing for the conversation that might end his military career. Field Marshal Ashworth surveyed the assembled Royal Guard with the keen eyes of someone who had spent decades evaluating military units and their capabilities. He observed their bearing, their equipment maintenance, and their obvious demoralization with the practiced assessment of a leader who understood both the technical and human aspects of military service. What happened next surprised everyone present, including Captain Marcus and his men. Instead of delivering the expected criticism or formal reprimand, Field Marshal Ashworth called the Royal Guard to attention and began to address them in a voice that carried clearly across the barracks courtyard. "Soldiers of the Royal Guard," he began, his words carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect throughout the military establishment for over 5 decades. "I have come here today not to add to the criticism you have already received, but to offer a different perspective on yesterday's events." The field marshal paused, allowing his words to register with the surprised soldiers before continuing. "I have witnessed more military ceremonies than perhaps anyone else in this kingdom, and I have seen units face challenges that tested their discipline, training, and character. What I observed yesterday was not a failure of soldiering, but a demonstration of the difference between ceremonial performance and military capability." Captain Marcus felt a surge of surprise and hope as he realized that the field marshal's assessment might be different from the harsh criticism that had dominated the previous 24 hours. Around him, he could see his men's faces beginning to show signs of cautious optimism as they listened to words that offered a more balanced view of their situation. Field Marshal Ashworth continued his address with the measured tone of someone who had given careful thought to his words. Military history teaches us that ceremonial skills and combat effectiveness are entirely different capabilities. Some of the finest fighting units I have commanded would have struggled with the complex parade formations you attempted yesterday. Conversely, some units that excelled at ceremonial duties proved less effective when faced with real military challenges. The Field Marshal's next words would prove to be the turning point that began to restore the Royal Guard's reputation and confidence. What I saw yesterday was a group of well-trained soldiers who faced an unexpected challenge with courage and determination. When things went wrong, you maintained your discipline and military bearing. You did not break formation. You did not abandon your posts, and you did not allow temporary confusion to become complete chaos. As Field Marshal Ashworth spoke, something remarkable began to happen. His assessment of their performance, coming from the kingdom's most respected military authority, started to change how the Royal Guard soldiers viewed their own actions. Instead of seeing only failure and embarrassment, they began to recognize that they had indeed demonstrated important military virtues even during their most difficult moments. Then, in a gesture that would be talked about throughout the military establishment for years to come, Field Marshal Lord Ashworth did something that no one present had ever seen before. The kingdom's highest-ranking military officer, whose own ceremonial uniform displayed decades of service ribbons and decorations, came to attention and rendered a formal military salute to the Royal Guard unit that everyone had been mocking just hours before.